I always hated flying, but this time I had no choice. My job had me on a last-minute trip to New York. I packed my bags and arrived at the airport exhausted. When I got to the gate, the area was almost empty. It was a late-night flight, and only a few people were there, scattered across the seats. I boarded the plane and found my seat right by the window. I always liked window seats because I could lean against them and try to sleep, but something felt different tonight. The air was stale, colder than usual, and there was a weird smell like old, damp clothes. I thought maybe it was the air conditioning. As the plane took off, I noticed the other passengers seemed off. Most of them were quiet, staring straight ahead. No phones, no books, no one even talking. I shrugged it off, thinking they were just tired. After all, it was a red-eye flight. But there was something about their faces, pale, blank, almost empty. The flight attendant passed by, and I stopped her to ask for a blanket. She didn't respond at first, just stared at me with glassy eyes, her face expressionless. After a few seconds, she finally nodded and handed me a blanket, but her movements were slow, almost robotic. Her hand felt cold and damp as it brushed against mine. I tried to distract myself, hoping to get some sleep. I closed my eyes, but I kept hearing this strange whispering sound. It was faint, like it was coming from the vents or the ceiling above. At first, I thought it was the sound of the engines or some air noise, but as I listened, I realized it was voices. They were whispering, too low to understand, but they sounded frantic, panicked, like they were trapped. I opened my eyes and glanced around. The cabin was dark, the lights dimmed for the night. I looked at the other passengers again. They were all still staring straight ahead, eyes open, unblinking. One man in the row across from me had his head turned slightly, and I thought I saw a trickle of blood dripping from his nose. But when I looked closer, it was gone. Suddenly, the plane jolted, a sharp drop that made my stomach flip. The lights flickered, and the captain's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, but his voice sounded strange, hollow. "Please fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing some turbulence." His voice faded in and out, like a radio struggling to catch a signal. I tightened my seatbelt, my hands shaking. Another jolt shook the plane, and the whispers grew louder. I could almost make out the words now, but they didn't make any sense. Help, can't breathe, so cold. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. I turned and saw a figure standing in the aisle. At first I thought it was a passenger, but then I realized they had no face, just a blank, smooth surface where their features should have been. They started walking slowly down the aisle, moving closer to me, their head tilted as if they were looking right at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding, hoping it was just a nightmare. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was right in front of me, leaning over, staring with that empty face. I could feel a cold breath on my skin, like ice, as it whispered, "Help me." I jerked back, pressing myself against the window, but it was gone. I looked around, hoping someone else had seen it, but the other passengers were still staring straight ahead, unmoving. The plane jolted again, and the lights went out completely. I could only see the faint glow from the emergency lights along the aisle. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around me. I thought I saw shapes moving in the dark, shadowy figures crawling up the walls, hanging from the ceiling. I could hear the sounds of heavy breathing, gasping, as if they were struggling to stay alive. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around and saw the flight attendant, her face pale, her eyes dark and sunken. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What do you mean?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "This plane. It crashed. 10 years ago. None of us ever made it." Her hand tightened on my shoulder, her fingers ice cold, digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. The whispers grew louder, and I could see the other passengers turning, finally looking at me, their faces twisted and decayed, like they'd been underwater for years. Their eyes were hollow, dark sockets staring straight through me. The plane began to shake violently, and the sound of screaming filled the air, echoing around me, blending with the whispers. I closed my eyes, clutching the armrests, praying it would all just stop. And then, silence. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the airport, sitting in the waiting area. The flight had been canceled due to weather, the announcement echoing over the speakers. I looked around, breathing heavily, my heart racing. The other passengers were gone, replaced by regular travelers, looking at their phones or chatting with each other. But when I looked down, I saw a piece of paper in my hand. It was my boarding pass, with a different date. 10 years ago, the realization hit me like ice water in my veins. Somehow, I'd experienced a flight that shouldn't have existed, or maybe it had. But in another time, another place. My hands shook as I clutched the outdated boarding pass. The date was there, clear as day, exactly 10 years ago to the night. I stood up, the sounds of the bustling airport around me seeming distant and hollow. My head spun, questions spiraling through my mind. What had I just experienced? Was it a nightmare? A hallucination? I stumbled over to the airport information desk, my voice shaking as I asked if there had ever been an accident on my original flight's route. The woman behind the desk frowned, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" she asked softly. I nodded, swallowing hard. I just need to know if there was ever an accident involving that flight, the late-night one to New York, maybe 10 years ago. She hesitated, glancing at her screen and then back at me. Yes. Actually, her tone grew cautious, like she wasn't sure how much to tell me. Flight 216 crashed shortly after takeoff due to engine failure. There were no survivors. She gave me a sad, uncertain look. But how do you know about that? My heart pounded as I looked back down at the boarding pass in my hand. Flight 216. I didn't answer her, I couldn't. My mind was reeling. I mumbled a quick thank you and walked away, my head swimming. I could still hear the whispers echoing in my ears, faint but distinct. "Help me. So cold. We're still here." I didn't know what to do, so I left the airport, telling myself that maybe I'd find answers outside, in the open air. But as I stepped through the automatic doors, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just across the street, in the shadows cast by the tall airport lights, stood the flight attendant from my nightmare, her uniform worn and tattered, her eyes dark and empty, staring right at me. I froze, my legs locked in place. She slowly lifted her arm and pointed at me, her lips moving, though I couldn't hear her words. I took a step back, my heart racing, and glanced around to see if anyone else noticed her. But the people around me walked on, oblivious, like she wasn't even there. Panicking, I turned and stumbled into the nearest taxi, slamming the door shut. I told the driver my address, my voice trembling. As we pulled away, I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see her still standing there, but she was gone. I slumped back in my seat, trying to catch my breath, hoping I'd finally left this nightmare behind. But when I got home, I realized the nightmare had followed me. I turned on the lights, desperate for any sense of normalcy, but something felt wrong. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and that smell, the same damp, stale smell from the plane, lingered in the air. I tried to shake it off as nerves, just my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it. A faint whisper, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. The same frantic, panicked whispers I'd heard on the plane. They were here, with me in my home. I took a step toward the hallway, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices echoing down the narrow corridor. My heart pounded as I saw shadows moving at the end of the hall, shifting and blending into each other like they were alive. Then, out of the darkness, I saw a figure step forward. It was one of the passengers from the plane, his face pale and twisted, his eyes hollow and dark. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a thin, ghostly wail, a cry that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The figure took another step closer, raising a hand toward me, and suddenly I could hear his voice, clear and desperate. "You saw us. You heard us. You have to help us." I shook my head, backing away. "I don't know how." "Remember us," he whispered, his voice fading as he dissolved into the shadows. The lights in my apartment flickered, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I was alone again, standing in my hallway, my heart pounding. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, somehow bound to me now. As I sank to the floor, exhausted and terrified, I realized they wouldn't leave me alone until I found a way to help them, to free them from whatever place they were trapped in. Every night since, I've felt their presence, heard their whispers just beyond the walls, seen glimpses of their faces in darkened mirrors. They're waiting for me to do something, to find a way to set them free. But I don't know if I can, or if I'll ever be free of them. It was supposed to be a routine business trip. The airline was a bit obscure, but they had a direct flight at half the price, so I booked it without a second thought. My journey started at the small, dimly lit terminal with only a few people waiting. The air felt unusually thick, like it was holding secrets it didn't want to share. I boarded the plane late at night, barely awake. My seat was near the wing, and I noticed how old the aircraft seemed. The seats were faded, and there was a strange, musty smell. I sat down and looked around. A few other passengers filled the rows, each looked just as weary as I felt. I told myself it was nothing, just a few hours, and I'd be there. I settled in and shut my eyes, hoping to sleep through most of it. The plane took off smoothly, and the hum of the engine was almost comforting. I drifted off, but it wasn't long before something woke me. It was the sound of whispers, low and almost impossible to catch. I opened my eyes, thinking maybe it was just my imagination, but the whispers continued, growing louder. It sounded like someone was right next to me, murmuring urgently. I turned to my left, but the seat was empty. I glanced around the cabin. No one was speaking. In fact, most of the passengers looked as if they were asleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was all in my head. But as I settled back into my seat, I noticed something strange on the window. There was a handprint smudged and oily right on the glass, facing inward. My heart skipped a beat. How could there be a handprint from the outside? We were miles above the ground, and no one had touched that window. I called the flight attendant, but she didn't come. In fact, I couldn't see any of the crew. I stood up, peering down the aisle, but it was empty. No one in sight. Where had they gone? Anxiety gnawed at me. I sat back down, determined to stay calm. Maybe the crew was in the back, handling something. But the whispers started again, louder this time. It was as if they were pleading with me, though I couldn't understand the words. Then, the lights flickered. My heart raced as the cabin lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. A thin red emergency light glowed along the floor, casting an eerie glow. I held my breath, hearing the whispers all around me now, coming from every direction. I could feel cold air brushing against my neck, as if someone was right there, just inches away. A shadow moved across the aisle, and I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a person, no, multiple people standing in the aisle, watching. Their faces were just vague, empty shapes in the darkness. They stood still, almost frozen, but the whispering grew louder, filling my head until I felt like I would scream. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. The entire plane shuddered, and my seat rattled. I grabbed the armrests, terrified that something had happened to the plane's engines. But as the turbulence stopped, the shadowy figures vanished. I gasped, looking around, but they were gone. The lights flickered back on, and everything looked normal, almost too normal. The passengers around me were fast asleep, as if they hadn't heard or seen a thing. I was breathing heavily, my skin cold and clammy. I glanced at my watch. It was stuck. The time hadn't changed since we took off. I checked the flight map on the screen in front of me, but it showed we were still over the ocean. The strangest part, we'd been in the air for hours. We should have been over land by now. The whispers returned, and this time they formed words. "Help us," they said, clear as day. "Help us, please." The plane jolted, and I looked out the window again. That's when I saw a face, pressed against the glass from the outside, pale and distorted, eyes wide with terror. I froze, unable to look away. The face was gone in an instant, but the whispers remained, filling the cabin, begging for help. Finally, the intercom crackled, and the pilot's voice came through, shaky and uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing a disturbance." His words were broken, distorted, almost like he was struggling to speak. Then, silence. The plane dipped suddenly, and I felt weightless, gripping the seat in panic. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating more faces, all of them pressed against the windows. They were everywhere, watching, their eyes hollow, pleading. The whispers turned into wails, desperate and filled with sorrow. My vision blurred as I felt something cold wrap around my wrists, holding me down. The lights flickered again, and in the dim glow, I saw the passengers around me had changed. They weren't asleep. Their eyes were open, wide and empty, staring straight ahead with expressions of horror frozen on their faces. I shut my eyes, trying to make it all go away. When I opened them, the cabin was empty. I was the only one left on the plane. No passengers, no crew, just rows and rows of empty seats. The plane was still moving, still flying, but I felt completely alone. A voice whispered in my ear, "You're one of us now." I looked down and saw my reflection in the window. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, just like the ones I'd seen before. The emptiness in the cabin gnawed at me, an unbearable loneliness, as though I were drifting through some dark limbo with no way out. I could still hear faint whispers, their voices blending into one long, chilling hum. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but they didn't feel like mine anymore, like something else had taken hold. I tried to stand, to move toward the front of the plane, but my legs felt heavy, as if invisible chains bound me to my seat. The screen in front of me flickered to life on its own, displaying an endless loop of static. Through the crackling pixels, I glimpsed something moving. I leaned in closer, squinting, and the image came into focus. It was a video feed of the cabin, of me. I watched myself sitting there, pale and horrified. My reflection in the feed had a hollow stare, yet it seemed to be smiling, lips curving into a dark, twisted grin. My heart thundered as I reached up to touch my face, but my own lips were motionless. The screen me was acting on its own, grinning wider, as though it knew something I didn't. Then, the grin faded, replaced by an expression of pure terror. The screen me was looking at something over my shoulder. I felt a breath on the back of my neck, cold and heavy, sending shivers down my spine. Slowly I turned my head, but I could see nothing except the dim, empty rows of seats stretching back into the darkness. "Please," a voice whispered close to my ear. I turned fully, and there, seated just a row behind me, was a figure, a man, barely visible in the dark, with hollow, haunted eyes fixed on me. His face was gaunt and sunken, his skin almost translucent. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, straining to hear him. "Help us," he mouthed silently, his fingers digging into the armrests as if he were trying to hold on. "Help us escape." Escape from what I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. His eyes widened, and he looked past me toward the back of the plane, terror flooding his face. His hands clutched the seat in front of him as though he were bracing for something. Slowly, I turned to follow his gaze. The shadows seemed to thicken at the back of the cabin, twisting and writhing like they were alive. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged, tall and indistinct. Its body was nothing more than a blur of blackness, a void shaped like a person. I couldn't see a face, only two empty eyes staring straight at me, filling me with a feeling of dread so intense I felt as though I might pass out. The thing moved forward, silent as death, gliding down the aisle. My body froze, paralyzed by an unseen force. As it drew closer, I could feel a chill wrapping around me, draining all warmth from the air. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't obey. The man behind me leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. "It's trapped us here," he whispered. "We're all stuck, every single one of us, bound to this flight forever, because of it." I finally found my voice, choking out a desperate, "Why? Why can't we leave?" The man's face twisted with sorrow. We tried to stop it. But it's too powerful. Once it's taken you, there's no escape. It needs us, to keep flying, to feed. The creature was only a few rows away now, its hollow eyes locked on me. I felt my heartbeat slowing, my thoughts fading, like it was sucking the life from me, even at a distance. I struggled against the invisible weight holding me down, desperate to escape, to wake up, to believe this was all just a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. I was trapped, truly trapped, on a plane that was flying to nowhere, with no hope of landing. The man behind me slumped forward, his face now empty, lifeless, like a doll whose strings had been cut. The thing had taken him. I could feel it drawing closer, its energy wrapping around me, cold and consuming. I looked out the window one last time, hoping for any sign of land, any sign of life. But there was nothing outside the window, just an endless, inky blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers grew louder, blending into a horrible symphony of sorrow and despair. I closed my eyes, feeling myself slip away, my consciousness dissolving like smoke in the wind. I knew then that I would become one of them, just another soul trapped in the endless loop, forced to fly with this cursed flight for eternity. Just before I lost myself completely, I heard a voice, my own voice, but distant and weak, echoing back to me. "Help us," it whispered, pleading, merging with the others. And in the depths of that darkness, I knew I would be saying those words for eternity, just like all the others. Somewhere in the endless night, on a plane that never lands, I am still flying, still whispering, still waiting for someone to hear us. But deep down, I know the truth no one ever will. I always hated flying. The cramped seats, stale air, and most of all, the feeling of being trapped in a metal box thousands of feet in the sky. But this flight was different. This was a last-minute trip for work, and I couldn't get out of it. I convinced myself it would be fine, just a few hours, a few movies, and I'd be back on solid ground. Little did I know that this flight would be the most terrifying experience of my life. I boarded late. My seat was in the middle of the plane, next to an older man who barely looked up when I squeezed past him. I buckled in, and soon the engines roared to life. We took off smoothly enough, but something felt off almost immediately. The cabin lights flickered as we ascended, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the passengers in the rows ahead staring forward blankly, as if in a trance. But when I blinked, everything looked normal again. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired. I leaned back, tried to relax, and closed my eyes. But as soon as I started to drift off, a sharp sound jolted me awake. It was the intercom crackling. The pilot's voice was garbled, but I caught a few words, ... slight turbulence ... remain seated. I looked around. None of the other passengers seemed to have reacted. They all just stared forward, eyes glazed over, barely blinking. It was strange, but maybe everyone was just exhausted. I looked out the window, hoping to distract myself, but all I saw was darkness. It didn't seem right. Usually you could see city lights or the glow of the moon reflecting on the clouds, but there was nothing, just a deep, endless black. I tried to turn on the overhead light, but it didn't work. Neither did the screen in front of me. I glanced at the older man next to me. He was staring forward, too, hands resting in his lap, not moving a muscle. I leaned over and whispered, "Excuse me, are you okay?" He didn't respond. Not even a blink. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I pressed the call button for the flight attendant, but no one came. I waited, glancing nervously around the cabin. Finally, I decided to stand up and go look for someone. As I made my way down the aisle, I noticed that every single passenger was completely still, staring forward with the same blank expression. No one was reading or sleeping, just sitting there, staring. I felt panic rising in my chest. What was going on? I reached the front of the plane and finally found a flight attendant standing by the cockpit door. She had the same blank expression as everyone else, staring straight ahead, not even acknowledging me. "Excuse me," I said, louder this time. "Something's wrong with the lights. And everyone is acting strange. Is everything okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. I reached out, hesitantly touching her arm, but she felt cold. So cold, I pulled my hand back immediately. A strange noise came from the cockpit door, a soft scratching, like something was clawing at the other side. My heart raced as I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then, suddenly it stopped. Silence. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just rows of passengers, all facing forward, eyes empty and blank. Then, all at once, they turned to face me. Every single one of them, slowly in unison, their heads twisting around like puppets. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they were all waiting for something. I backed away, bumping into seats as I made my way back to my row. Then the intercom crackled again. This time it was a deep, raspy voice, not the captain's. "Passengers of Flight 404, you have entered the void. There is no escape." The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the passengers were all back in their original positions, staring forward as if nothing had happened. I sat down, gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The minutes felt like hours. I didn't dare close my eyes, afraid of what might happen if I did. The plane was silent, no sounds of engines, no hum of the air conditioning, just a deafening, suffocating silence. Finally, I felt a dip, like the plane was descending. I looked out the window, hoping to see the glow of an airport below, but all I saw was the same endless darkness. The intercom crackled again. "We have arrived." The plane jolted, and I was thrown forward in my seat. I looked around, but all the passengers remained still, staring ahead, as if nothing had happened. I unbuckled my seatbelt, moving toward the window to get a better look outside. That's when I saw a vast, empty field stretching endlessly in all directions, covered in a thick, swirling fog. I could just make out the shapes of other planes scattered across the field, some old and rusted, others looking as if they'd crashed only recently. I turned back toward the other passengers, my heart pounding, and that's when I realized. They weren't passengers at all. Their faces were blank, featureless, as if they were nothing more than empty shells. Slowly, one by one, they began to rise from their seats, moving toward me with stiff, mechanical movements. I backed away, panic overwhelming me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember was the feeling of cold, lifeless hands grabbing my arms, pulling me toward the exit. And then, darkness. When I woke up, I was alone in an empty field, surrounded by the wreckage of Flight 404. The fog was thick, swirling around me, and in the distance, I could see the shadows of other passengers, their blank faces staring at me from the mist. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I'll ever get out. But I know one thing for sure: Flight 404 never landed, and I am trapped in this void forever. I don't know how much time has passed. In this place, there's no way to tell. The fog is dense, curling around me like a cold, damp shroud. Sometimes I see other figures in the mist. They're passengers, or they were once. They drift through the fog like shadows, faceless and silent, moving in slow, shuffling steps. At first, I tried to call out to them, desperate for any form of connection. "Hey, over here," I shouted, my voice echoing into the empty void. But they never respond. They don't even look at me. It's as if they're here, but not really here, trapped between worlds, wandering endlessly through this dark, foggy purgatory. I started walking, hoping I could find an edge to this place, a boundary I could break through. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe an airport, maybe some sign of life, anything that could explain where I was. But the fog never ends. The ground beneath my feet is soft, almost like ash, and it stretches on in every direction. I tried to leave marks in the ground, something to let me know if I was walking in circles. But every time I turn around, the marks are gone. Then I began hearing whispers. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, just soft murmurs carried on the cold wind. I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the fog playing tricks on me. But they grew louder, and now I can hear them clearly. They speak in broken fragments, phrases that barely make sense left. Before, again, and trapped. No way out. Sometimes the whispers sound like my own voice, repeating words I never remember saying. I don't sleep anymore. I don't even know if I can sleep in this place. My eyes feel heavy, but there's a sharpness in the air that keeps me alert, like I'm always on the edge of a nightmare that never fully comes. I tried to sit down, to close my eyes and rest, but as soon as I did, I felt a presence, just behind me, a cold breath against my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the fog. But the presence is always there, watching, waiting. I've tried to walk away from it, but no matter where I go, I feel it just behind me, pacing, growing closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. Then, one day, if I can call it a day, I stumbled across something in the fog. A row of seats, torn from the plane and scattered across the ground. They looked old, weathered, as if they had been here for years. I recognized them immediately. They were from Flight 404. I reached down, brushing my hand across the fabric, and that's when I saw my bag, lying there in the seat where I'd been sitting. It was exactly as I'd left it, the zipper still slightly open, a book poking out. I knelt down, grabbing the bag and holding it close. It was real, something familiar in this endless, shapeless world. But when I looked up, I saw them, the passengers, standing in a circle around me, their faces still blank, watching me without eyes, without expression. Please, I whispered, clutching the bag like it could protect me. Please, let me go. I don't belong here. They didn't respond, but I felt a pressure, a weight in the air, growing heavier by the second. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, filling my mind with a chorus of voices. Stay. With us, no way out, you are one of us. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the plane. The lights were dim, and the seats were filled with passengers, all staring forward with that same empty, lifeless gaze. My heart pounded as I looked around, and that's when I noticed my own reflection in the window beside me. My face was pale, my eyes wide and empty, just like theirs. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if I were paralyzed. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The only thing I could do was stare forward, trapped in my seat, frozen like the others. The whispers echoed around me, a soft, sinister lullaby that filled the cabin. Flight 404, the voice crackled over the intercom, calm and emotionless. We are ready for departure. Destination nowhere. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to move, gliding down an invisible runway in the endless darkness. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, not from the ascent, but from the realization that I would never leave this place. And then, just as the plane took off, the fog outside the windows began to clear, and I caught a glimpse of the ground below. It was littered with wreckage, pieces of planes scattered across the landscape, twisted metal and broken wings. And in the shadows, I saw them, the passengers, standing in silent rows, staring up at the sky as we ascended into the void. This is my new reality. A passenger of Flight 404, trapped in a place where time doesn't move, where the fog never clears, and where there is no escape. I know now that I am doomed to fly forever, suspended between life and death, surrounded by the silent, staring faces of the lost. And as the plane continues its endless journey, I can feel myself slipping away, becoming one of them, just another empty face, staring forward forever. It was the red-eye flight, and the airport was almost empty. I had taken night flights before, but there was something different about this one. The air felt heavy and cold as I boarded the plane, and I couldn't shake off a strange sense of unease. The plane was unusually quiet as I walked down the aisle. The passengers were few and scattered, most of them already asleep or lost in their phones and books. I found my seat near the back of the plane, right by the window. I usually liked window seats, but tonight I felt exposed. The window was dark, reflecting the empty cabin and the dim lights. I buckled my seatbelt and tried to settle in, but something in me resisted. Something was wrong, but I couldn't tell what. As the plane took off, I glanced around, trying to distract myself. There were only a handful of other passengers, an elderly woman 2 rows ahead of me, a young couple further up, and a few others scattered here and there. Everyone seemed normal, but as I settled in, the overhead lights flickered, and the plane lurched slightly. I shrugged it off as turbulence, but the flickering continued, casting strange shadows on the faces of the sleeping passengers. About an hour into the flight, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I could see my breath, misting in the cold air. I tightened my coat around me and looked around. Nobody else seemed to notice the cold, even though it was now freezing. The lights flickered again, and this time I saw something in the aisle. At first, I thought it was a shadow, maybe cast by someone walking. But as I squinted, I realized it wasn't moving like a shadow should. It was just there, dark, hazy, and unnaturally still. I blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the light, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there, standing in the middle of the aisle, looking right at me. The shape had no clear features, no face, just a dark, towering figure that seemed to be absorbing the light around it. My heartbeat quickened, and I wanted to scream, but my voice was frozen. I gripped my seat, and before I could do anything, the figure melted into the darkness. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I was just tired, seeing things. After all, night flights could be exhausting. But then, the flickering started again, more aggressively this time. It felt like the plane was caught in a storm, though there were no clouds or turbulence outside. I looked around, desperate for reassurance, and saw the elderly woman staring at me. Her eyes were wide and terrified, and she mouthed something I couldn't understand. I leaned forward, trying to hear her, but she turned away suddenly, as if something or someone was behind her. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me not to, but I couldn't resist. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was again. The shadow, closer this time, leaning over my seat. I could feel the weight of its gaze, even though it had no eyes. My skin prickled, and I felt a suffocating darkness closing in around me. The plane jolted, and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into pitch black, with only the faint emergency lights on the floor guiding the way. I fumbled for my phone, hoping the light would offer some comfort, but as I turned it on, I realized every other passenger was staring straight ahead, expressionless. Their eyes were glazed, and they all looked wrong, almost like mannequins, frozen and lifeless. I could feel tears pricking my eyes, and I wanted to scream, but I was too afraid to draw attention. The figure was still there, now leaning over me, filling the space around me with a suffocating, icy chill. It raised one shadowy hand, and as it reached for me, the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. But the silence remained. I looked around, hoping someone else saw what I did, but everyone was back to normal. The elderly woman was asleep, the young couple was dozing peacefully, and no one seemed to have noticed a thing. The rest of the flight was tense and quiet. I didn't sleep, I didn't dare close my eyes. When we finally landed, I rushed off the plane, feeling like I'd escaped something horrible. But as I looked back one last time, I saw the dark figure, standing in the shadows of the plane's door, watching me. I'll never know what it was or why it was there, but I'll never forget that night flight. Even now, I sometimes wake up, feeling that same cold presence watching over me, as if it followed me off the plane. Even though I managed to get off that flight, the feeling of unease stayed with me. It lingered in my mind, haunting my thoughts like a bad dream that I couldn't quite shake off. After that night, I avoided night flights. I told myself it was just paranoia, a reaction to a bad experience, but deep down, I knew it was something more. There was something dark, something truly wrong, that had followed me off that plane. Weeks went by, and slowly I started to feel a little normal again. I chalked the experience up to sleep deprivation and nerves, but every so often, in the quietest hours of the night, I would feel a cold draft, as if someone had opened a window. I would wake up shivering, my breath misting in the air, and find myself staring into the shadows of my room, half expecting to see that figure standing there. One night I woke up again to that chilling cold. This time, however, the draft was more intense, like a frigid wind blowing through my room. My bedside clock read 3 a.m., and the room was pitch dark. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but as I fumbled to turn it on, my fingers touched something cold and hard. I jerked my hand back, a sharp breath catching in my throat. I could barely make out the outline, but it was unmistakable. The dark figure stood beside my bed, towering over me, just as it had on the plane. I could feel its icy presence pressing down on me, a suffocating weight that made it impossible to move or even scream. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping it was just a hallucination, but when I opened them, the figure was still there. Closer this time. It didn't have a face, yet I could feel its gaze boring into me, filling my mind with a terror that I couldn't explain. It reached a shadowy hand toward me, and as it got closer, I felt a freezing pain spread through my chest, like my heart was turning to ice. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and turned on the light. The figure vanished instantly, leaving only an intense cold that hung in the room like a heavy fog. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting in the corner of my room, my back pressed against the wall, watching and waiting. But nothing happened. The following night, I could hardly bring myself to go to bed. The hours ticked by slowly, every sound amplified in the silence. Just when I thought I'd managed to calm down enough to sleep, I felt it again, that creeping chill, filling the room and stealing my breath. I didn't dare open my eyes. I lay still, pretending to be asleep, hoping it would leave me alone if I didn't acknowledge it. But the cold grew stronger, and I could feel something hovering just inches from my face. I kept my breathing steady, shallow, hoping it wouldn't notice. But then, it spoke. Its voice was a low whisper, hissing through the darkness. "I know you're awake." I froze, the sound sending ice down my spine. The voice was unnatural, distorted, like a static-filled radio. It was close enough that I could feel its cold breath against my skin. "Why did you leave me?" it asked, the words barely more than a hiss. I didn't know what it meant. Leave it? I had no idea what it was talking about. I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't come. I was paralyzed with fear. The whisper grew sharper, angrier. "You left me on that flight." I was overwhelmed with terror, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure's presence pressed down on me, colder and heavier with every second. It leaned in close, and I could feel the chill sink into my skin, like frost spreading through my veins. Then, without warning, the pressure lifted, and the cold receded. I gasped for breath, finally able to move again. The room was empty, but I could still feel its presence lingering, like a dark shadow hanging over me. From that night on, I started seeing the figure everywhere, not just in my room, but in reflections, in crowds, in the corner of my eye. No matter where I went, it was there, waiting, watching. Sometimes it would reach out to me, its shadowy hand stretching toward me through mirrors, through windows. And every time I would hear that same chilling whisper. "You left me." I don't know what it is or why it chose me, but I can feel it drawing closer. Night after night, the encounters grow stronger, its presence more demanding. I can't escape it, no matter where I go. It's as if it's bound to me now, a dark shadow haunting my every step. And tonight, as I sit here writing this story, I can feel it beside me. The air around me has turned ice cold, and that familiar whisper fills my ear. "I'll never let you leave me again." The seatbelt sign flashed on, casting a soft amber glow across the dim cabin. I clicked my belt shut with a nervous chuckle, feeling a bit silly for even a hint of anxiety. I'd flown dozens of times before, but tonight was different. The whole day had felt strange and off-kilter vibe from the moment I'd left my apartment. A missed alarm, a spilled coffee, and a forgotten passport had already thrown my day into disarray. Still, I shrugged it off, just chalking it up to bad luck. But now, thousands of feet above the ground, I couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. I glanced around the cabin, my gaze settling on the other passengers. Most were either dozing or distracted by their screens, totally oblivious. I noticed a man across the aisle from me, his eyes darting nervously toward the window every few seconds. It wasn't just me then. Someone else felt it too, that sense of something lurking just out of sight. As the cabin lights dimmed further, the hum of the engines grew louder, almost like a low, ominous growl. I tried to distract myself by staring out of the window. Thick clouds swallowed the view, a vast sea of black that seemed to pulse with its own hidden life. I leaned closer to the glass, hoping for a glimpse of the city lights below or stars above, but all I saw was endless darkness. That was when the flickering began. At first I thought it was my eyes playing tricks. Tiny flashes of light appeared outside the window, darting here and there like fireflies. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. There, in the darkness, the flashes grew brighter, swirling and dancing in strange patterns. I leaned closer, pressing my face almost against the glass, but then they vanished, leaving nothing but darkness. Suddenly there was a loud creak, like the groan of an old ship, echoing through the cabin. The lights flickered, dimming for a heartbeat before flaring back to life. A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing around with uneasy expressions. The man across the aisle caught my eye, his face pale and drawn, and I could tell he had seen the lights too. Then the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through. But something was wrong. It didn't sound like the usual calm, reassuring tone pilots used. There was a tremor, an edge of fear that made my skin prickle. "This is your captain speaking ... We're experiencing ... unexpected ... interference. Please ... remain seated." The intercom went silent, but the tension in the air only grew. The plane shuddered, a violent tremor that shook my bones and made my stomach lurch. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls and seats, twisting familiar shapes into something sinister. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, and deliberate, they echoed through the cabin, as if someone or something was walking down the aisle. I craned my neck, peering over the seats, but I saw nothing, just empty rows stretching into the darkness. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder and louder, until they seemed to be right beside me. I felt a cold breeze brush past me, chilling my skin, and my breath hitched as a strange smell filled the air, a sickly sweet scent, like decaying flowers. My heart pounded as I realized that the footsteps had stopped right beside my seat. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just empty air. A sudden hiss filled the cabin, and I spun around to see a thin mist seeping out from the overhead vents. It coiled and twisted, drifting down like fog, filling the aisles with a faint, ghostly glow. My fellow passengers were finally taking notice, their faces pale and anxious as they clutched at their seatbelts. Some whispered nervously, others glanced around in confusion. And then I heard a voice, faint and distorted, whispering my name. I froze, my pulse racing as I strained to listen. It was coming from the intercom, a soft, breathy voice that didn't sound like the captain at all. It sounded ancient, tired, and cold, like it had traveled a long, dark road just to reach me. "Leave ... leave, while you can." I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the mind. But then the voice grew louder, filling the cabin with its eerie plea. "They are here ... they never left." The plane shuddered again, and I gripped the armrests, feeling panic surge through me. I looked around, and that's when I noticed that some of the passengers looked ... wrong. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were blank, staring straight ahead without blinking. It was like they weren't there at all, like they were just ... hollow shells. The mist grew thicker, swirling around the cabin, making it hard to see. Shadows moved within it, shapes that darted and twisted, just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, staring at me from the window. It was pressed up against the glass, its bony fingers tapping in a slow, rhythmic pattern that echoed through the cabin. Tap, dot, 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 tap, dot, tat, tat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, my body locked in fear. The face grinned wider, its mouth stretching into an unnatural, grotesque smile that seemed to mock me. "Join us," it whispered, its voice echoing inside my head, filling my mind with images of darkness and despair. "You can't escape, dot, 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 we're all lost here." And then, with a final, bone-chilling laugh, it vanished, leaving nothing but an icy handprint smeared across the window. The plane shuddered violently, and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into total darkness, the only sound the terrified whispers and gasps of the passengers. I fumbled for my seatbelt, heart racing, as the plane began to descend rapidly, the pressure making my ears pop painfully. I could barely breathe, and every second felt like an eternity. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered back on. The cabin was empty. Every seat around me was vacant, the passengers gone, as if they had never been there. The only sign they had ever existed were their belongings, bags, jackets, even half-finished drinks scattered across the seats. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and made my way down the empty aisle. My footsteps echoed through the silent cabin, and every shadow seemed to watch me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. As I reached the front of the plane, I saw the cockpit door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and peered inside. The cockpit was empty, the controls flickering with strange, otherworldly symbols that pulsed with a cold, blue light. And there, in the captain's seat, was a figure, a shadowy, ghostly form with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that was all too familiar. It turned to face me, raising a bony hand in a mocking salute. "Welcome aboard, dot, 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 forever." Before I could scream, the world faded into darkness, and the last thing I heard was the haunting whisper of voices, echoing in my mind as the plane descended into the endless void below. And now I am here, lost, trapped, forever bound to the haunted skies, with no escape. I never liked flying, but this time there was no choice. My best friend was getting married, and the flight was the only way I could make it in time. I had read about so many strange things happening on airplanes, but I always brushed them off as mere fiction. However, nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Flight 799. It was a late-night flight, and the airport was almost deserted. The terminal was eerily silent, and only a few travelers were scattered around. As I waited to board, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just pre-flight nerves. As I boarded the plane, I noticed how empty it was. Maybe 10 people in total, scattered across rows of seats. It felt odd. I'd never seen a flight this empty, even at night. The flight attendants looked tired, their smiles forced. There was something off about their faces, but I tried not to stare. I settled into my seat near the wing and glanced out the window. The airport lights cast a dull glow, but the sky was pitch black, darker than usual. When we took off, I felt a chill run down my spine. The engines roared, louder than I remembered, and for a moment I thought the plane was struggling to get into the air. But then, we were up, soaring through the dark sky. After about an hour, the cabin lights dimmed. The announcement said we could relax and even nap if we wanted to. I leaned back and closed my eyes, trying to block out my unease. But just as I was drifting off, a strange noise jolted me awake, a faint tapping sound from under my seat. I leaned down, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but saw nothing. Probably just the plane settling, I whispered to myself, but the sound continued, steady and rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It felt like something was trying to get out. I told myself I was imagining things and tried to ignore it. But then, I noticed the woman sitting 2 rows ahead of me. She was staring at me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. I gave her a small nod, but she didn't react. She just kept staring, her eyes unblinking. I felt a shiver run down my spine and turned to look out the window, hoping to escape her unsettling gaze. As I looked out, my stomach dropped. The clouds outside were glowing red. They looked like flames, swirling around the plane, almost as if we were flying through a firestorm. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but the eerie glow remained. I thought about asking the flight attendant, but when I glanced back up the aisle, something else caught my attention. A dark figure was standing at the end of the aisle, just staring at us. It was tall, much taller than any of the flight attendants, with its face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see any details, but I felt its gaze piercing right through me. I tried to call for help, but my voice was barely a whisper. My throat felt tight, as if something was pressing against it. Then the lights flickered. The cabin went dark, and all I could hear was heavy breathing, but it wasn't mine. It was coming from right behind me. I froze, afraid to turn around. My heart was pounding so loud, I thought it might burst. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to look, but there was nothing there, just empty seats and shadows. When the lights came back on, the figure at the end of the aisle was gone, but so were a few passengers. I counted the heads quickly. There were only 6 of us left. Panic surged through me. Where had they gone? I hadn't seen anyone move, and there had been no announcements. I looked around for the flight attendants, but they were nowhere in sight. The woman who had been staring at me earlier was still there, but now she was mumbling something under her breath, rocking back and forth. I strained to hear her words, but they made no sense, just fragments of sentences, jumbled together. Her eyes were still wide, filled with terror, and she clutched the seat in front of her so tightly that her knuckles were white. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. It was the captain, but his voice was distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, each word drawn out, "we are entering a different zone. Please, remain seated." A different zone? I had no idea what that meant, but the words sent a chill through me. I turned to the window again, and this time I gasped. The red clouds were gone, replaced by a vast, endless darkness. No stars, no moon, just an abyss stretching out as far as I could see. It was like we had left Earth behind entirely. Then, the tapping started again, louder this time. I could feel it vibrating through my seat, and before I could stop myself, I leaned down to look. In the dim light, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me from under the seat. They were empty, soulless, and I felt my blood run cold. I shot up, heart racing, and looked around desperately for help. But the other passengers were gone. All of them. I was alone in the cabin. I stumbled down the aisle, hoping to find a flight attendant, the captain, anyone. But the plane felt empty, lifeless. I reached the cockpit door and banged on it, shouting, but there was no response. Just as I was about to give up, the door creaked open. Inside, the cockpit was dark, except for a faint red glow illuminating the controls. And in the pilot's seat was something. It looked human, but its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, its eyes dark and hollow. It turned to look at me, and its mouth twisted into a smile that sent ice through my veins. "Welcome," it whispered in a voice that wasn't human, "to your final destination." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and the door slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness. I could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty cabin. I ran down the aisle, trying to find an exit, but every door was sealed tight. The plane felt like a cage, closing in around me. Then, the lights flickered one last time, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my seat, and the plane was landing. I looked around, heart pounding, but the other passengers were there, chatting as if nothing had happened. The flight attendants were smiling, and everything seemed normal. For a moment, I thought it was all a nightmare. But as I grabbed my bag and turned to leave, I noticed something under my seat, a pair of empty, dark eyes staring back at me. I froze. Those eyes were still there, unblinking, staring straight at me. It was as if they'd followed me, attached to the shadowy thing hiding beneath the seat. I blinked hard, but when I looked again, they were gone. I rushed off the plane, pushing past the other passengers. I didn't care if they thought I was being rude, I just wanted to get as far away from that flight as possible. As I walked through the terminal, everything felt wrong. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows, and there was a strange silence that swallowed the usual sounds of a bustling airport. I told myself I was just shaken up, that it was just my mind playing tricks. But that comfort quickly disappeared. When I passed a glass wall, I glanced at my reflection and felt my stomach drop. There, standing just behind me, was that same tall figure I'd seen on the plane, the one I thought I'd left behind in the dark cabin. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just an empty hallway. I tried to convince myself that it was stress, fatigue, some weird hallucination. But as I walked toward the baggage claim, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone or something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see those hollow eyes in the crowd. When I finally reached the baggage claim, I saw a man standing near the carousel, looking at me with a strange expression. His clothes were from another era, like something out of an old, black and white photograph. He wore a neat suit, a hat tipped low over his face, and he was holding a leather suitcase. Something about him seemed faded, like he wasn't entirely there. Our eyes met, and he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. His lips pulled back too far, showing too many teeth, almost as if he'd forgotten what a smile was supposed to look like. Then, just as quickly, he vanished into the crowd. I looked around, hoping someone else had seen him, but everyone was going about their business, oblivious. I decided I'd had enough. I didn't care about my luggage anymore, I just wanted to get out of that airport. As I made my way toward the exit, the overhead announcement system crackled to life. Attention, Flight 799-2. Now boarding at Gate 13. I stopped in my tracks. Flight 799? That was my flight, the one I had just taken. The blood drained from my face as I listened, frozen in place. I'd heard stories of ghost flights before, of planes that somehow reappeared long after they'd disappeared, but I'd never believed them. But there it was, Flight 799, boarding again as if it had never landed. I looked around, desperate for some explanation, but everyone around me seemed normal, going about their business. I walked back to the gate, unable to help myself. I had to see it, had to know if it was real. When I reached Gate 13, the boarding door was open, and a flight attendant was standing there, smiling that same strange smile I'd seen before. She looked at me, her eyes almost pleading, and whispered, "Don't get on." I stepped back, my heart pounding. Before I could say anything, another voice called out from behind me. It was the man from the baggage claim, the one with the old-fashioned suit. He was standing right next to me, his face too close, his breath cold against my skin. "You already missed your flight, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and raspy. "Once you get on, you can never get off." I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I turned and ran, sprinting down the terminal as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the exit, where I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The night was silent, the parking lot eerily empty. But as I reached my car, I froze again. My reflection in the window was wrong. Instead of my own face, I saw something else, a hollow-eyed figure staring back at me, just like the one on the plane. I blinked, and it was gone, replaced by my own frightened reflection. I got in the car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know how long I drove or where I ended up, but eventually I pulled over on the side of the road, unable to go any further. I sat there, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, that the flight had been normal and I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. My phone would ring at odd hours, but there was only silence on the other end. At night, I'd hear tapping on my bedroom window, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. I started to see shadows out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. One night I woke up to the sound of someone breathing in my room. I held my breath, my heart pounding, and forced myself to look. Standing in the corner was the same figure I'd seen on the plane, the tall, dark shape, its face hidden in shadow. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and whispered, "You can never leave." I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my neighbors called the police. When they arrived, they found me curled up on the floor, shivering and unable to speak. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just traumatized from the flight. But deep down, I knew the truth. Flight 799 had taken me somewhere, and now, no matter where I went, a part of it followed me. Every night, I hear the tapping under my bed, or see those empty eyes in my mirror, watching me, waiting. And every night, I hear the announcement in my dreams. "Attention, Flight 799-2. Now boarding at Gate 13.